Captain Daniel Danrook had always known that space travel was unpredictable, but nothing could have prepared him for what happened when his ship crash-landed on an unknown planet. He had been on a routine mission to explore uncharted space when an unexpected asteroid storm forced him to make an emergency landing. The crash was rough, but Dan survived, only to find himself stranded on a world far more dangerous than he ever imagined. The planet was strange, covered in dense jungles and towering alien-like plants. The air was thick with moisture, and the sky glowed an eerie purple hue. He barely had time to assess his situation when he was ambushed. Dark, insectoid figures emerged from the underbrush. Xerithians, the planet's dominant species. They were tall, with glossy black exoskeletons and glowing green eyes that pierced through the gloom of the forest. Dan quickly realized he was no longer in control of his fate. The Xerithians were a mysterious and ancient race, known for their intelligence and strength, but their society was highly secretive and isolationist. They had little contact with other species, and Dan quickly understood why. They saw themselves as superior. His heart pounded as he was surrounded by these imposing figures, their sharp mandibles clicking in a rhythmic, unsettling pattern. Before he could react, a female figure stepped forward. She was larger than the others, her features more regal, with a crown-like structure on her head and a sharp, commanding presence. This was Vraz Kora, the queen of the Xerithians. She towered over Dan, her violet exoskeleton shimmering in the dim light, and her eyes narrowed as she took him in. Dan tried to speak, but the words stuck in his throat. There was something in her gaze that made him feel small, insignificant. Still, he couldn't help but notice how beautiful she was in an intimidating, alien way. "You are human," Vraz Kora said in perfect English, her voice low and commanding. Dan was taken aback. He hadn't expected them to understand his language. "I am Captain Daniel Rook of the Earth Federation," he replied, trying to sound more confident than he felt. Vraz Kora's eyes glowed brighter. "You are the one we need," she said, as if the words were already decided. "Your genetics, they are unique. You are to come with me." Before he could protest, he was taken away by her guards. They moved with incredible speed, and in no time, Dan found himself in the heart of a massive alien palace. The architecture was unlike anything he had ever seen, with walls made of strange, iridescent material that shimmered under the soft glow of alien lights. He was brought into a grand chamber where Vraz Kora awaited, sitting on a high throne-like seat, her posture regal and perfect. "I am Vraz Kora, queen of the Xerithians," she said, her eyes scanning him like he was some sort of specimen. "And you, human, will play a vital role in the future of my people." Dan looked confused. "What do you mean? I'm just a soldier. I'm not some experiment." Vraz Kora's expression shifted, her mandibles clicking again as she considered him. "We have tried for generations to solve our reproductive crisis. Our species has reached the brink of extinction, and no matter how many times we attempt, the females of our race cannot carry offspring. But you, human, are different. Your biology is resilient. It is perfect." Dan's heart skipped a beat. He had heard of alien species having strange and often disturbing rituals. But this was something different. Vraz Kora wasn't just interested in him as a prisoner. She wanted him for something far more intimate. "Wait," Dan said, taking a step back. "You want me to? What?" The queen's expression hardened. "Your species has what we need, human, and you will provide it." Before he could fully understand what was happening, a strange ceremony began. The room dimmed as alien instruments came to life, glowing with eerie light. He had no idea what to expect, but he knew one thing. The fate of his future, and possibly of humanity, was about to be shaped in ways he could never have imagined. Vraz Kora looked at him with cold determination. "Prepare yourself, human. You will impregnate me. You will carry the future of my species." Dan's mind raced, but before he could speak, a strange compulsion overtook him, and his body reacted in ways he could not control. The world around him blurred as he faced the alien queen, who was not only a leader but now the mother of a new, unpredictable future. Vraz-Kora, the queen of the Zerithians, stood in the center of her grand chamber, her mind racing with anger and disbelief. The ceremony had taken place hours ago, and the results were undeniable. Her body, once incapable of carrying life, was now beginning to show signs of pregnancy. A human, a mere human male, Captain Daniel Rook, had impregnated her on the very first try. The idea itself was enough to send waves of fury crashing through her. The Zerithians had always prided themselves on their superiority. They had explored countless worlds, conquered vast stretches of space, and maintained the purity of their bloodline for centuries. But now, here she was, a queen of an ancient and powerful race, carrying the child of a human, a species they considered primitive, weak, and unworthy of such an honor. The shame was unbearable. It was a betrayal of everything her people believed in. Vraz-Kora paced furiously in the chamber, her sharp mandibles clicking together in a rhythmic, almost frenzied pattern. Her guards stood at a distance, unsure whether to approach. They had never seen their queen in such a state of emotional turmoil before. Normally, she exuded control and grace, a leader who commanded respect and authority. But now she was a woman torn between pride and rage, between duty to her people and the reality of her situation. How could this happen? She muttered to herself. How could I, the great queen of the Zerithians, be so utterly defeated? Her voice was low but filled with venom. She turned to one of her advisors, an older Zerithian named Korak, who had served her for many years. Korak, she snapped, explain to me why this human is the one to carry my offspring. Why does his biology work when ours has failed? Korak hesitated before answering, his antennae twitching nervously. Your Majesty, the humans, their biology is different. Their genes are more resilient, more adaptable. It seems that their DNA possesses a kind of vigor that we have not seen in our own kind for generations. Perhaps it is the answer we've been searching for. Vraz-Kora's eyes narrowed. She hated the answer. She hated that it made sense. The Zerithian race had spent countless years trying to overcome their genetic weakness, and now, here they were, relying on a human to save them. A human. A race that had never even come close to matching the Zerithians in strength, intellect, or technological advancement. How could her people accept this? What are you suggesting? Vraz-Kora's voice was cold now, sharp like a blade. That I, the queen, a ruler of unparalleled strength, must rely on the genes of a primitive earthbound creature to save my species. Korak lowered his head. It is the only solution, Your Majesty. The human male's genetics are compatible with yours in a way that Zerithian males are not. This child, it could carry the genetic diversity we need to restore our race. You must accept this, for the sake of the Zerithians. Her heart burned with fury at the idea of relying on this human, but as much as she wanted to reject it, Vraz-Kora knew Korak was right. The Zerithian race was dying, and they had no other option. The rebellion against her rule was growing stronger, and her people were losing hope. If she refused this child, they might lose everything. But still, the idea of carrying the offspring of a human was too much for her pride to bear. She slammed her fist against the wall, the sound echoing through the chamber. I will not be a mere vessel for a human's child, she shouted, her voice filled with rage. Korak stepped forward cautiously. You have no choice, Your Majesty. The child is already growing inside you. You cannot change that. You must prepare yourself for the future. Her eyes burned with anger. I will prepare, but not for this. Not for this disgrace. As Vraz-Kora stood there, wrestling with her emotions, her thoughts turned to Captain Daniel Rook, the human male who had unknowingly changed everything for her people. She had no respect for him. He was weak, unworthy of her, and yet there was something in him that made him unique. There was a strength in him that she couldn't ignore. Maybe it was his will to survive, or perhaps it was the fierce determination in his eyes when he stood before her. He might be a human, but in some way, he reminded her of the Zerithians of old, strong, unyielding. Vraz sighed deeply. She had to accept the truth. The human would be a part of her life now, whether she liked it or not. And whether she wanted to or not, they would need each other if the Zerithians were to have any hope of surviving. The question now was, could she control this new path, or would it control her? The news of Queen Vraz unexpected pregnancy spread like wildfire throughout the Zerithian capital. It wasn't long before the once secure political structure of the Zerithian race began to fracture. The ancient matriarchal society had always prided itself on its purity, but now the very foundation of their belief system was being shaken. The queen was carrying the child of a human, and no one knew how to handle the fallout. Inside the grand palace, Vraz sat on her throne, her posture rigid, her mind swirling with conflicting emotions. Around her, the Zerithian council gathered, an assembly of the most powerful and influential leaders in her empire. They were all present to discuss the future of their species, but the air in the room was thick with tension. Each member of the council had their own opinions about the queen's situation, and none of them were willing to ignore the facts. The queen's child could be our salvation. Korak, the queen's most trusted advisor, began, his voice steady but filled with concern. The human male's genetic material is strong and adaptable. Our species has been struggling for generations to find a solution to our reproductive crisis, and now we have an answer. But this is madness, protested Sor, a high-ranking council member with a fierce loyalty to the Zerithian traditions. We cannot allow this. The queen has sullied herself with the seed of a primitive creature. How can we allow a human to be a part of our royal bloodline? This is a disgrace to our people. Vraz eyes flashed dangerously, but she remained silent. She knew that the council had a point, even if she didn't want to admit it. The Zerithians had always valued their purity, their bloodline. The idea of a human child, part Zerithian and part human, was almost too much for many of them to bear. Korak, ever the mediator, stepped in. Sor, we are facing extinction. We cannot afford to let our pride blind us. If the child is what we need to save our species, then we must accept this. The human's biology could be the key to our survival. But the queen's position is weakened, said another council member. Xalnera, her voice cold and calculating. The rebels are already growing bold. If they find out about this child, it will only fuel their hatred for the throne. We need to deal with the situation before it spins out of control. The mention of the rebels made Vraz jaw tighten. The growing insurgency was a constant threat to her reign. And now, with this scandal threatening her rule, it seemed like they might finally have the upper hand. The queen had managed to keep the rebellion at bay through fear and political maneuvering, but she knew that the situation had become more volatile. This pregnancy could be the thing that broke her power. Sor, sensing an opportunity, leaned forward. I propose that we remove the human from the palace. He is a symbol of weakness. If we isolate him, the queen's reputation can be restored, and we can prevent the rebels from gaining any more support. No, Vraz said sharply, her voice laced with authority. Captain Rook stays. His genetics are crucial for the future of our race. I will not let anyone threaten my child's existence. Zor looked taken aback by the queen's fierce declaration, but he quickly regained his composure. But, Your Majesty, you do not understand the danger this poses. The rebels see this as a sign of your failure. We cannot allow this scandal to spread further. We must take action before it is too late. I will not be intimidated, Vraz replied coldly, her eyes narrowing. You have your duties, but I have mine. I will not let my people crumble under the weight of their own fears. We will adapt, or we will perish. The human male stays. The council members exchanged uncertain glances, but none of them dared to challenge the queen directly. They knew that while she was angry and confused, she was also the most powerful leader the Zerithians had ever known. Her decision was final. As the meeting ended and the council members slowly filed out, Vraz-Kora was left alone with her thoughts. The weight of her decision pressed heavily on her. She knew that by keeping the human male in the palace, she was courting disaster. The Zerithians would either embrace this new future or tear themselves apart trying to resist it. And somewhere deep inside, she knew that the child she carried was no longer just a symbol of her own failure. It was the only hope her species had left. Outside the palace walls, the whispers of the rebellion were growing louder. The time for action was coming soon, and Vraz-Kora could only hope that the human male, Dan, would be able to prove his worth, not just to her, but to the entire Zerithian Empire. If he failed, they would all pay the price. Queen Vraz-Kora sat in the darkened chamber, staring at the glowing blue symbols etched into the ancient walls. The strange alien text, which had once been a mystery to her, now felt more like a puzzle she was forced to solve. She had come here hoping to find some answer to the growing tension within her people. But as the words on the walls flickered, it became clear that the answers she sought weren't just in the texts. They were hidden in the very history of the Zerithians. Dan, the human male, had been kept under close watch, though not in chains. The Zerithian queen had ordered him to remain within the palace, but she had no idea what to do with him. He had become more than just a symbol of rebellion against the old ways. He was now the key to her species' future, and it was a future that she wasn't prepared for. "Come," Vraz-Kora finally called out. Her voice was stern, but something in her tone showed a trace of uncertainty. The door opened and Dan entered, his face calm but guarded. "I don't understand any of this," Dan said, his voice flat. "You want my genes to save your species, but you don't even want me here. I'm a prisoner, a tool." Vraz-Kora turned to face him, her eyes glowing faintly. "You may not be a prisoner, but you are a key to something far larger than yourself," she said. "You have no idea what you've gotten yourself into, human." Dan crossed his arms, clearly frustrated. "So, what? I'm just supposed to help you. Help your species keep living, even if it means, I don't know, being part of some strange experiment." "More than you think," Vraz-Kora replied, her voice cool. "I have brought you here not just for your biology, but for what you represent." He looked at her, puzzled. "What do you mean?" She hesitated for a moment, her gaze drifting toward the walls. "My people, the Zerithians, once reached out to other species. We tried to form alliances, to merge our knowledge with other races. But over time, we became insular, obsessed with maintaining the purity of our bloodline. That was our downfall." Dan listened carefully, his curiosity piqued. He had no love for his captors, but something in her tone made him want to understand more. Vraz-Kora continued, her voice growing quieter. "Many centuries ago, we tried to mate with other species, humans among them. At the time, it was seen as the way to strengthen us, to ensure our survival. But we were too proud, too certain of our superiority. We rejected the idea, convinced that we could continue our legacy alone." Dan frowned, trying to process this new information. "So, you're saying that this pregnancy isn't just an accident. It's part of something bigger, like an experiment." "Exactly," Vraz-Kora said sharply. "The last attempt to save us. When our population began to decline, we saw out the most resilient species. And you, human, are a part of that. But we failed to find success until now. And I, the Queen, am now a vessel for what could be the only chance for the Zerithians to survive." The weight of her words settled heavily in the air between them. Dan felt a strange mix of guilt and curiosity. This wasn't just about his genes. It was about their entire civilization. He hadn't signed up for any of this, but now he couldn't just walk away. "Why didn't you tell me this before?" Dan asked, his voice low. "Why keep me in the dark about all of this? Why am I just the pawn in your game?" Vraz-Kora looked at him, her face unreadable. Because, human, you would have refused. You would have resisted. We had to ensure you would comply. Dan shook his head, feeling a mix of anger and confusion. You could have just told me from the start. We could have worked together, instead of this manipulation. Vrazkora's eyes flickered with something almost resembling regret. You would not have understood. And neither did I, at first. This child, our child, is not just a product of your biology. It is the future of my people. I have no choice but to carry it. I have no choice but to rely on you. The words hit Dan harder than he expected. He thought of himself as just a simple soldier, someone who followed orders, someone who did his job. But now he was being asked to be something more. He was being asked to shape the future of an entire species. I never wanted this, he muttered, staring at the ground. I did not either, Vrazkora said softly. But we must do what we can to survive. If this child is the answer, then it is our only hope. Dan was quiet for a long moment. He had no idea what the future held, but he knew one thing. Things were beyond his control now. He had to make the best of it. Vrazkora turned away from him, gazing once more at the glowing symbols on the wall. There is much more to our legacy than I thought. And now, you are a part of it. She paused, her voice quiet but firm. I will need you, Captain Rook. If we are to survive, you and I must work together. Dan nodded slowly. I guess we don't have much of a choice, do we? No, Vrazkora said, her voice heavy with determination. We do not. The days following their conversation grew tense. Vrazkora, the Zerithian queen, remained focused on the future of her people, her child, and the uneasy alliance with Captain Daniel Rook. But outside the palace walls, the stirrings of rebellion had become impossible to ignore. The Zerithian capital, once a city of peace and order, was now a place of whispers and rumors. The rebel factions, who had long opposed the queen's reign, had grown bolder. What started as minor protests and discontent had begun to turn into full-scale demonstrations. The news of the queen's pregnancy, and the human who had fathered her child, had sparked outrage among the people. To them, it wasn't just a matter of politics, it was a violation of everything the Zerithian race stood for. In a hidden chamber deep within the palace, Vrazkora stared at the monitors, watching the unrest unfold. Her hand clenched into a fist as she saw the crowds gathered in the streets, chanting against her rule. They saw her as weak, as a ruler who had betrayed her own species, a queen who had allowed a human to shape the future of the Zerithians. We must take action, Korak, her most trusted advisor, said, stepping into the room. His tone was grave. The rebellion is growing stronger by the day. The people no longer trust you. If we don't act soon, we will lose everything. Vrazkora didn't reply immediately. Her mind raced, weighing the options. She could order a crackdown, arrest the rebel leaders, and silence the protests. It was a path she had taken many times before. But now, with a human child growing inside her, the political landscape had changed. She couldn't afford to risk more bloodshed, not when the future of her people hung in the balance. We cannot just suppress them, Vrazkora finally said, her voice cold but thoughtful. We need a new plan, one that will unite the people, not divide them. Korak raised an eyebrow. Unite them? How? The very idea of your child, the human's child, has shaken the faith of the Zerithians. They will never accept this. Vrazkora's eyes hardened. Then we will make them accept it. We will show them that this child is not a threat to their legacy. It is the future of our species. Meanwhile, Captain Rook had been kept isolated, under constant guard, but still treated with a level of respect. He knew that Vrazkora had no choice but to keep him alive. For now. But it was becoming clear to him that he was caught in the middle of something far bigger than himself. His role had shifted from that of a captive to something more like a symbol, an unwilling pawn in the Zerithian struggle for survival. He spent his days in the palace, wandering the alien halls, unable to escape the tension that lingered in the air. Vraz Kora had kept her distance, though he noticed the occasional softening in her gaze when their paths crossed. Perhaps it was the bond they now shared, or perhaps it was the simple fact that his survival meant the survival of her people. But things were changing. He overheard whispers among the guards, noting how the rebellion was not just a political movement. It was now a personal vendetta. The rebels didn't just want to overthrow the queen. They wanted to destroy the human child growing inside her. One evening, as he paced the corridors, lost in his own thoughts, a figure stepped from the shadows. It was Kalnera, one of the council members, known for her cunning and ruthlessness. She motioned for him to follow her. "I have information that may be of interest to you," Zalnera said, her voice soft but urgent. "The rebellion is planning something. They believe the only way to truly overthrow Vraz Kora is to eliminate her child. And you, human, are their target." Dan felt a cold chill run down his spine. He had known things were bad, but he hadn't realized how far the rebels were willing to go. "What do you mean? Eliminate the child?" he asked, his voice thick with disbelief. Zalnera looked around, ensuring they weren't being watched. "The child is the symbol of everything the rebels despise. If they can kill it, they believe they can destroy Vraz Kora's power and end the queen's bloodline once and for all. You, too, will likely be caught in the crossfire." Dan felt the weight of her words settle on him. His role in all of this had just become more complicated. If the rebels succeeded, it wouldn't just be a loss for Vraz Kora. It would be a loss for both their species. The Zerithians would be left without a leader, and humanity's future would be uncertain at best. "I have to warn her," Dan said, already turning toward the nearest exit. But Zalnera stopped him with a firm hand on his shoulder. "You cannot go to her yet," she said urgently. "Vraz Kora is not trusted by her own people. She is surrounded by traitors. If you want to protect the queen and the child, you must work from the shadows. The rebellion is closing in, and they will strike soon." Dan hesitated, torn between his loyalty to Vraz Kora and his desire to protect his own life. But there was no time to waste. The danger was real, and if he didn't act quickly, the future of both their races could be lost. As he looked at Zalnera, he knew one thing for sure. The real battle was about to begin. And this time, he wasn't just a bystander. He was a key player in a fight that could determine the fate of an entire species. The palace was a place of constant watchfulness. Captain Daniel Rook knew that his every move was being observed, every word weighed carefully. His role had shifted once again, from prisoner to protector. A protector of the queen's child, and possibly the future of an entire species. But he wasn't sure how long he could remain in the queen's good graces if the rebellion succeeded in overthrowing her rule. Word had spread like wildfire throughout the rebel ranks. Zalnera's warning echoed in Dan's mind. The rebels were planning to strike soon. The people's anger had reached a boiling point. They viewed the child Vraz Kora carried as a symbol of everything wrong with their society. The queen had betrayed their traditions by allowing a human to father her child. The rebellion saw it as an opportunity to seize power. If they killed the queen's child, they could weaken her grip on the throne, and possibly bring down the whole empire. Dan wasn't sure what to believe anymore. In the quiet moments, when he wasn't under surveillance, he could hear the distant murmurs of unrest outside the palace walls. The people were divided. Some still held loyalty to the queen, but many others had turned against her. The rebels had gathered strength, and it seemed like a matter of time before they made their move. The palace guards had become restless, too. Every time they passed by him in the halls, Dan saw the suspicion in their eyes. They weren't just watching him. They were watching everyone. The sense of betrayal was palpable, and it was beginning to feel like the walls were closing in. One evening, after a long day of quiet tension, Dan was summoned to Vraz Kora's chambers. She was seated on a high platform, gazing out over the capital through the large window that overlooked the city. The moonlight bathed her in a soft, otherworldly glow. It was a sight that made her seem almost unreachable, like a ruler from an ancient myth. Dan approached cautiously, his boots echoing in the vast room. "You wanted to see me, Your Majesty." Vrazkora turned slowly, her eyes intense but tired. "There is little time, Captain Rook. I have learned of the rebels' plan. They intend to strike soon. They will not only come for me, they will come for my child." Dan's stomach churned at the mention of the child. He knew the stakes had grown higher with each passing moment, but hearing it spoken aloud made the danger feel real. "I already know about the rebels. Zalnera warned me." Vrazkora's gaze sharpened. "Zalnera. She has her own motives. Be careful whom you trust, human. She has too much ambition for her own good." Dan nodded. "I understand. But the rebels have their sights set on your child. We need to act quickly. The city is on edge, and the strike could come at any moment." Vrazkora stood up, her body radiating a quiet strength. "Then we must prepare. I will not let them destroy my child. I will not let them destroy the future of my people." Dan hesitated. "What do you need me to do?" Her eyes softened just for a moment. "I need you to protect me and the child. There will be no more room for mistakes. If the rebellion succeeds, everything will fall apart. Zerithians will turn on each other, and your people will be drawn into the conflict." The weight of her words hung in the air. He realized then that his fate, too, was tied to hers. His choices would determine not just the future of the Zerithian people, but his own future as well. He had no clear allegiance to the Zerithians. His loyalty was to his own people, to Earth. But that had changed. The child inside Vrazkora was more than just a symbol. It was the key to an alliance, a bridge between two very different worlds. If it fell, everything would be lost. "I will do what I can," Dan said firmly. "But we need to move fast. I'll gather what forces I can. We can't wait any longer." Vrazkora nodded, her expression resolute. "You will have my trust, Captain. But know this, we are not just defending a child. We are defending the future of both our species." The Queen's words were heavy, and Dan felt the burden of them deep within his chest. But this wasn't a time for hesitation. The rebellion was closing in. The palace was no longer a sanctuary. It was a battlefield. As he left Vrazkora's chambers, Dan's mind raced. There were only so many places to hide within the palace. There were only so many loyalists left to defend her. He could already hear the sound of footsteps echoing through the halls, a constant reminder that time was running out. Outside, the sky darkened, and the first signs of the storm began to appear. The rebels were making their move. Dan took a deep breath, adjusting his uniform. He wasn't sure what would happen next, but he knew one thing. He wasn't going to let the child die without a fight. And the coming storm would decide everything. The night was thick with tension as the city of Zerithian's capital braced for the impending storm. The palace was quieter than usual, the silence oppressive. Dan Rook stood in the shadows, eyes darting from one end of the hall to the other. His hand rested on the hilt of his weapon, though he knew this wouldn't be a fight won with guns or knives. It was a battle for survival, and every move he made could tip the scales. Vrazkora, the Zerithian queen, had gathered her most trusted allies and loyal soldiers. There were fewer of them than before. The rebellion had taken its toll, but they were ready to fight, ready to protect the child she carried, the child that held the future of their species. Dan walked through the halls, the weight of the situation pressing down on him. He had never signed up for this. He wasn't a soldier of the Zerithian Empire, and he certainly didn't care for their politics. But now, with the rebellion closing in, he had no choice but to stand with them. The rebellion's forces were massive. They had already infiltrated parts of the city, and reports came in of rioting in the streets. The capital was no longer a safe place, not for the queen, not for anyone. He arrived at Vrazkora's chambers, where the queen stood by a large window, staring out at the growing chaos below. Her eyes were cold, yet there was something else in them. Determination, but also fear. "Captain," she said, her voice steady despite the chaos unfolding outside. "Are the defenses in place?" Dan nodded, his eyes scanning the room. "The guards are in position. We've reinforced the main entrances, but it won't be enough. The rebels have too many numbers." Vrazkora turned to face him, her posture regal, her gaze unwavering. "We fight not just for survival, Captain Rook. We fight for the future of our species." Dan didn't respond right away. He had no idea what the future would look like. But he knew one thing: if the rebellion succeeded tonight, everything would be lost. The Zerithians would turn on each other, their fragile alliances would break, and the human race would be dragged into the conflict. It wasn't just about the child anymore. It was about everything that came after. "We need a strategy," Dan said, finally breaking the silence. "We can't hold them off forever with just defense. We need to strike back." Vrazkora nodded. "I have a plan, but it will require all of us working together. If we fail, there will be no hope for us. The rebellion will destroy what little we have left." "Tell me the plan," Dan said, a sense of urgency in his voice. The Queen motioned to a large holographic map that flickered to life before them. "We have a secret tunnel system beneath the palace, one that was designed for times of emergency. It leads to a hidden exit outside the city walls. But we cannot just leave. The rebels must be distracted long enough for us to escape." Dan's mind raced. A tunnel was their only way out, but if the rebels found it before they did, they would have no chance of survival. "How do we distract them?" "We attack," Vrazkora said simply. "I will lead the soldiers in a counterattack. We will draw them into the central courtyard. That's where the rebels will expect us to fight. You will take the child and get to the tunnel entrance. It's hidden in the lower levels of the palace." Dan's eyes narrowed. "And if they find us?" "We fight," the Queen replied, her voice cold and fierce. "There will be no surrender. This is the last stand for the Zerithian people, and for the future of your kind, Captain Rook." Dan knew the stakes. He could see the determination in her eyes. This was more than just about the Zerithians. It was about survival, his survival, their survival. The future of both species rested in the balance. The sound of shouting and distant explosions echoed from outside. The rebels were getting closer. Dan turned to Vrazkora. "We're running out of time. Let's move." Without another word, they hurried through the halls. As they passed through the corridors, Dan could hear the sounds of fighting growing louder. The palace was under attack. The rebels were already inside. Vrazkora led the way, her sharp gaze never wavering. They reached the hidden passageway quickly. As the last door closed behind them, sealing off the chaos above, Dan looked back at the Queen. "This is it," he said. "Let's make sure they don't win." Vrazkora's lips curved into a slight smile, though it was filled with a quiet sadness. "For our future," she said softly. The path ahead was dark, the tunnel lit only by faint flickering lights along the walls. They moved quickly but cautiously, knowing that time was running out. The sound of explosions and gunfire echoed through the walls. The palace was collapsing around them, but they had one final chance to escape. After what felt like an eternity, they emerged from the tunnel, finding themselves outside the palace walls. The capital stretched out before them, burning in the distance. Dan looked over at Vrazkora. Her face was marked with the weight of the battle they had just fought. But there was a spark in her eyes, a glimmer of hope. The rebellion had been pushed back for now, but the war was far from over. They had escaped the first battle, but the future was uncertain. For the child, for their species, for humanity. As the dawn broke over the horizon, Dan realized that the fight was just beginning. And this time, they would fight together.